June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. Captain George Baker watched 32 men from his platoon die in the first 15 minutes of the landing. Not because they were cowards, not because they were poorly trained. They died because when the critical moment arrived, when chaos erupted and every second mattered absolutely, they hesitated. Their bodies didn't obey instantly because their minds hadn't been trained to obey without question. My grandfather found Baker's diary years later, and the first entry from that day read, "I survived because my body reacted automatically. I didn't think, I didn't decide. I simply executed what I had trained 1,000 times. The men who died beside me hesitated for 2-3 seconds trying to decide what to do, and those seconds killed them." During the following months while fighting across France, Captain Baker obsessively documented the difference between soldiers who survived and soldiers who died. And he discovered a devastating pattern. It wasn't courage, intelligence, or physical strength that determined who would return home. It was something much simpler and much more brutal. Soldiers who survived had transformed discipline into automatism through fanatical daily repetition. Soldiers who died relied on motivation, on making the right decisions under pressure, on reacting intelligently when chaos erupted. My grandfather noted that Baker had written, "War taught me that you don't win battles when they come. You win them months before." Through 1,000 small daily repetitions that transform conscious choices into automatic responses, you will discover what Baker did every single day that kept him alive when better men died, and how to apply this brutal method to your invisible war against the version of yourself that loses to yourself every day. I found Captain George Baker's journal in a wooden box in my grandfather's basement, hidden behind gardening equipment that hadn't been used in years. Baker had served with my grandfather in the 29th Infantry Division and survived from D-Day to the end of the war, a nearly impossible statistic given that the casualty rate in his unit exceeded 300% throughout the conflict. When I began to read, I understood why my grandfather had kept those notebooks as if they were sacred texts. Baker hadn't written a romantic war diary full of heroism and victories. He had documented with brutal scientific precision what separated men who survived from men who died, and the answer wasn't what anyone would expect. It wasn't courage, it wasn't luck, it wasn't even exceptional skill. It was something much simpler and much more devastating. Soldiers who survived had turned obedience into automatism through fanatical daily repetition, while soldiers who died relied on making the right decisions under pressure. The first detailed diary entry, written 3 days after D-Day, described how Baker had survived the first 15 minutes on Omaha Beach when 32 of the 40 men in his platoon were killed or wounded. He noted, "I didn't survive because I was braver than Private Anderson, who died 3 meters from me. I didn't survive because I was faster than Corporal Mitchell, whose body we never found. I survived because when the boat ramp lowered and all hell broke loose, my body simply executed what it had trained 1,000 times. I ran, I threw myself, I crawled, I shot, without thinking, without deciding, without hesitating. The men who died beside me hesitated for 2-3 seconds trying to process the chaos, trying to consciously decide what to do. And those seconds killed them because in combat, thinking is dying slowly." During the following months, while fighting through Normandy and then France, Baker obsessively documented this pattern. He realized that surviving soldiers had something in common that had nothing to do with innate characteristics. They had done the same training every day for months before the actual combat, until every movement became as automatic as breathing, cleaning weapon, checking equipment, holding position, reacting to ambush. Everything had been repeated so many times that when the critical moment arrived, when there was no time to think, the body simply executed without the need for conscious decision. But soldiers who died, even the intelligent and courageous ones, trusted too much in their ability to react correctly under pressure. They trusted that when the time came, they would make the right decisions. And they died discovering that under real fire, the human mind does not make rational decisions. It panics, it hesitates, it freezes. You are dying the same way those soldiers died, only your death takes decades instead of seconds. You trust that when the time comes, when it truly matters, you will make the right decisions. You believe that motivation will appear when you need it, that willpower will manifest when crucial, that discipline will emerge when absolutely necessary. And while you wait for that magical moment that never comes, you lose to yourself every day. You lose when the alarm rings and you negotiate 5 more minutes. You lose when you promise to start tomorrow for the 1000th time. You lose when you choose immediate comfort instead of necessary discomfort. And you call it a lack of motivation when it's actually a lack of automatism developed through brutal daily repetition. If you want to honor Captain George Baker and learn what he discovered about transforming discipline into automatism, leave your like now. Don't abandon this soldier who documented the difference between living and dying so that you could learn without bleeding. Baker began systematically documenting his daily training during the preparation period before D-Day. He noted that for 6 months in England, before the invasion, he performed the same morning routine every single day without exception, waking up at 5 in the morning, checking his equipment, completely meticulously cleaning his weapon, practicing specific combat movements for 30 minutes, not because he felt motivated, not because he enjoyed it, not because he saw immediate results, but because he had understood something that most soldiers ignored. When the real chaos arrived, he wouldn't have time to decide what to do. His body would need to execute automatically, or he would die trying to think. He wrote, "Other soldiers trained when they were motivated, when they felt like it, when officers forced them. I trained every day at the same time with the same sequence because I was programming my body to obey without consulting my mind." During the first months of combat, Baker witnessed the devastating difference between soldiers who had developed automatism and soldiers who relied on making the right decisions under pressure. He described a specific incident in July 1944 where 2 soldiers, both equally technically trained, reacted in opposite ways to a German ambush. The first soldier, Sergeant Williams, had undergone mandatory training but never developed automatism through fanatical daily repetition. When the ambush occurred, Williams hesitated for 3 seconds, consciously trying to decide what cover to seek, which direction to move, how to return fire. Those 3 seconds killed him. The second soldier, Corporal Hayes, had repeated the same ambush reaction movements every day for months. When the first shot was fired, his body simply executed. He didn't think, he didn't decide. He simply moved automatically for cover, returned fire, repositioned. Hayes survived not because he was smarter or braver, but because he had transformed obedience into automatism. But what devastated Baker while documenting this wasn't just that daily repetition saved lives. It was realizing that most soldiers intellectually understood the importance of training, but never actually implemented consistent daily repetition. They trained when they felt the need. They trained when they were motivated. They trained when circumstances forced them, but they never developed the sacred habit of doing the same thing every day at the same time until it became as automatic as breathing. And this failure to transform knowledge into automatism through brutal daily repetition was what killed them when the critical moment arrived. Baker wrote with brutal clarity, "The difference between life and death is not knowledge. Every soldier knows what he should do. The difference is automatism. Soldiers who survive have done the same thing so many times that the body executes it without the need for conscious decision. You make the exact same mistake that killed Sergeant Williams and hundreds like him. You intellectually understand what you need to do. You know you should wake up early. You know you should train. You know you should work on the important goals. But knowledge without automatism developed through brutal daily repetition is useless when the critical moment arrives. And the critical moment arrives every day, every morning, when the alarm goes off and you have 3 seconds to decide whether to execute or negotiate. If you're still consciously deciding, you've already lost." In August 1944, Baker began to detail specifically what he did every day and why that particular sequence was crucial. My grandfather had underlined several times the entry where Baker explained that waking up at 5 in the morning wasn't about productivity or about making the most of the day. It was about winning the first battle before his mind fully woke up and began to negotiate. He wrote, "I have found that the first 3 seconds after I wake up determine whether I have won or lost the entire day. If my body runs automatically, I get up, check equipment, begin the routine without consulting my mind. But if I hesitate for 3 seconds, my mind wakes up and begins to offer reasons why I can sleep another 5 minutes. And once I begin to negotiate with my own mind, I have already lost. This was the devastating truth that separated soldiers who survived from soldiers who died. Soldiers who survived did not give their minds time to question, negotiate, or decide. Baker had developed a specific sequence that he performed in the first 15 minutes after waking up, always in the same order, always at the same pace, without variation. Wake up, feet on the floor, stand up, check weapon, check equipment, 30 push-ups, wash face with cold water, review day's goals. The sequence itself wasn't magic. What was crucial was that he had repeated it so many times that his body performed it automatically, even when his mind was still half asleep, even when he was exhausted, even when every fiber of his being wanted to remain lying down. And this automation of the first 15 minutes created momentum that carried over into the rest of the day. He noted, "I realized that soldiers who won the first battle of the morning were 3 times more likely to win all the other battles of the day, but soldiers who lost in the first 3 seconds, negotiating with the alarm, rarely recovered." But what my grandfather noted most attentively was the part where Baker described the price of developing this automatism. During the first 40 days of performing the same routine, it was pure torture. His body resisted. His mind offered 1,000 reasons why he could skip just today. The discomfort was intense, not because the routine was physically difficult, but because every cell of his being wanted to return to the old patterns of waiting for motivation, of negotiating terms, of consciously deciding. But Baker had understood something fundamental. Automatism does not develop through motivated execution. It develops through mechanical execution, repeated in exactly the same way, so many times that the body stops consulting the mind. And the first 40 days were where most gave up, because the discomfort of forcing execution without motivation seemed unbearable. You give up exactly where Baker almost gave up in the first 40 days. You try to create a morning routine. You try to wake up early. You try to execute a disciplined sequence. But in the first few days, when the discomfort is at its peak and the results are invisible, you give up. You go back to relying on motivation that never appears. You go back to negotiating with your mind every morning. And you never develop the automatism that Baker developed, because you never get past the first 40 days of brutal mechanical execution without negotiation. Around September 1944, Baker had spent about 90 days performing the same morning routine without exception. He wrote something that my grandfather had circled 3 times. "Today I woke up and my body simply executed the entire sequence before my mind even processed that I was awake. There was no negotiation. There was no decision. There was no should or shouldn't moment. It simply happened. And I realized I had finally killed the inner negotiator that had kept me weak for 24 years. This was the transformation that separated men who survived from men who died. Soldiers who survived had completely killed the part of the mind that negotiates, that asks for exceptions, that offers reasons why today might be different. They were not stronger than other men. They had simply removed the option of negotiation through repetition so fanatical that execution became the only possible response. Baker described in detail what happened to soldiers who never killed their inner negotiator. He observed Private Thompson, a technically competent soldier who always negotiated with himself. Thompson woke up when he felt like it. He trained when he was motivated. He carried out orders when he agreed with them. And in small situations, this worked because the consequences of negotiating were small. But Baker documented that in November 1944, during a patrol operation, Thompson hesitated for 5 seconds when he should have immediately executed an order to move for cover. He didn't hesitate out of cowardice. He hesitated because his automatic mind was still asking, should I or shouldn't I, instead of simply executing. Those 5 seconds killed him. Baker wrote, "Thompson died not because he was cowardly or incompetent, but because he had never killed his inner negotiator through brutal repetition. Until the last second, his mind was still asking permission to obey." But what devastated Baker wasn't just that negotiation killed soldiers in combat. It was realizing that most people spend their entire lives negotiating with themselves and never experience what it means to execute without questioning. They wake up and negotiate whether they get up now or in 5 minutes. They start working and negotiate whether they focus or check their cell phone. They promise to train and negotiate whether they do it today or tomorrow, and they call this flexibility, listening to the body, being kind to themselves, when in reality it's just weakness disguised as wisdom. Baker had discovered that real strength doesn't come from making the right decisions under pressure. It comes from eliminating the need for decision-making through such deep automatism that execution is the only option available. He wrote, "Weak men negotiate, strong men execute, and the difference between the two is not ability or courage. It's simply how many times you repeated the same action until negotiation ceased to exist as a possibility. You're living exactly like Private Thompson lived, negotiating with yourself every day with every decision, believing it's normal to have to consciously decide whether to execute or not. But this constant negotiation is what keeps you weak. It's what keeps you trapped. It's what slowly kills you over decades as you waste potential trying to decide if today is the day you finally stop negotiating. If you want to learn the rest of the protocol Baker used to completely kill the inner negotiator, subscribe to this channel now. Join the trenches of men and women who decided to stop negotiating and start executing without question. Don't abandon Captain Baker. Subscribe and honor the method he developed through 90 days of brutal execution. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Baker witnessed something that brutally confirmed everything he had documented about daily repetition. He wrote about Corporal Jenkins, a soldier who had been exemplary for months, faithfully executing the same morning routine, developing an automatism that kept him alive through dozens of battles. But in mid-December, Jenkins began to negotiate with himself. One day, he woke up 10 minutes later because he was exhausted. The next day, he skipped part of the routine because he felt he had already developed enough discipline. On the third day, he decided he could be more flexible because he was under too much stress. Baker wrote, "I watched Jenkins dismantle in a week the automatism that had taken months to build. And when the German attack came on December 16th, Jenkins hesitated. Not much, maybe 2 seconds, but 2 seconds were enough. He died not because he never had automatism, but because he believed he could pause the daily repetition without consequences. What Baker discovered was devastating in its simplicity. Automatism isn't something you build once and maintain forever. It's something you rebuild every day, through repetition, or that you lose through exception. Every time you perform the same action at the same time in the same way, you strengthen the neural pathway that makes that action automatic. But every time you skip it, every time you negotiate, every time you make an exception, you weaken that pathway and strengthen the negotiation pathway. And the negotiation pathway is infinitely more seductive because it offers immediate relief from the discomfort of unmotivated execution. Baker had noted with brutal clarity, "The day you skip it isn't just a lost day. It's the day you teach your body that execution is optional, that negotiation is acceptable, that exceptions are allowed. And once your body learns that, you have to start all over again." My grandfather had underlined several times the passage where Baker described the difference between soldiers who maintained automaticity and soldiers who lost it. Soldiers who maintained automaticity did the same thing every day without exception, regardless of how they felt, regardless of circumstances, regardless of whether they were motivated or not, rain or shine, sick or healthy, motivated or depressed. The execution happened at the same time in the same way because it had become as automatic as their heartbeat. But soldiers who lost automaticity were those who began to create categories of exception. Not today because I'm too tired. Not today because the circumstances are special. Not today because I've already proven I have discipline. And each exception, no matter how justified it seemed, undid weeks of building automaticity. You're doing exactly what killed Corporal Jenkins. You build momentum for a few days, maybe a few weeks. You start executing a morning routine. You start feeling like you're developing discipline. And then you create an exception. Not today because you slept badly. Not today because it's the weekend. Not today because you've already proven you can do it when you really want to. And each exception isn't just a lost day. It's the day you destroy the automatism you were building and have to start all over again from scratch. Baker survived the entire war because he understood that there are no exceptions. Either you do it every day without negotiation, or you become a slave to your own mind, which will always find reasons why today can be different. In early 1945, Baker began documenting something deeper he had discovered about daily repetition. It wasn't just about building habits or developing discipline. It was about fundamentally transforming who you are through repeated actions until the action and the identity became indistinguishable. He wrote, "I realize that I am not a soldier who performs a morning routine. I am the morning routine. I am not a person who has discipline. I am discipline manifested in human form. The difference is not semantic. Men who have discipline can lose it. Men who are disciplined cannot stop performing without ceasing to be who they are." This was the ultimate transformation that separated surviving soldiers from all others. They didn't do disciplined things. They had become discipline incarnate through 1,000 days of repetition without exception. Baker described how he witnessed this identity transformation in himself and in a few soldiers around him. At first, waking up at 5 in the morning was something he did. It was an external action he performed on himself, often against his will, always with conscious effort. But after months of daily repetition without exception, something fundamental changed. Waking up at 5 in the morning was no longer something he did. It was who he was. His body simply woke up at that time because it had become part of his physical identity. And when identity changes, execution ceases to require effort because you are no longer forcing behavior that contradicts who you are. You are simply being who you have become through 1,000 repetitions. He noted, "Soldiers who survive don't fight against themselves every day to execute. They have become execution through repetition so profound that stopping would be an existential contradiction." But what my grandfather recorded in most detail was the part where Baker explained why most people never experience this identity transformation. They do things, they try to build habits, they perform routines when motivated, but they never repeat the same action long enough for the action to become identity. They skip days, they create exceptions, they change routines when they get bored, and each interruption not only breaks the habit, it reinforces the old identity of a person who needs to negotiate with themselves, who depends on motivation, who performs when they feel like it. Baker had discovered that real identity transformation required at least 120 days of execution without exception. Not because magically in 120 days you became different, but because 120 days of execution without negotiation completely killed the old identity that lived on exceptions. You never truly transform because you never repeat something long enough to kill your old identity. You still identify as someone who struggles with discipline, who needs to motivate themselves, who negotiates with themselves. And while you maintain that identity, every action is a struggle because you're trying to force behavior that contradicts who you believe yourself to be. If you recognize that you've spent years trying to build habits without transforming your identity, and you want to learn how Baker used brutal repetition to become disciplined instead of just having discipline, leave a like now. Don't abandon this soldier who discovered that real transformation doesn't come from doing different things, but from becoming a different person through 1,000 repetitions of the same action. In March 1945, Baker documented the true cost of maintaining daily running without exception for over a year. He noted that it wasn't the physical discomfort of waking up early or running the routine that threatened to break his consistency. It was something far more subtle and dangerous, the constant temptation to rationalize exception under the guise of wisdom. His mind offered sophisticated arguments for why skipping a day was not only acceptable, but was actually the smart decision. He was exhausted from months of continuous combat, so rest would be prudent. He had proven his discipline through hundreds of consecutive days, so a break was deserved. The circumstances were exceptionally difficult, so being flexible was healthy adaptation, and each argument seemed reasonable in isolation. But Baker had learned that rationalization is merely negotiation disguised as logic, and if he gave in once, he would teach his body that running had conditions. Baker described a specific moment in April 1945, a few days before the end of the war, when he nearly broke his daily execution routine. He was ill, feverish, exhausted beyond what he considered humanly bearable, and his mind presented the most compelling argument it had offered in months. Continuing to execute under these conditions was not discipline, it was self-sabotage. A wise man would rest. An intelligent man would listen to his body. A balanced man would recognize that even discipline has limits. Baker spent 20 minutes that morning negotiating with himself, something he hadn't done in over 6 months. And then he realized something devastating. His mind wasn't trying to save him from exhaustion. It was trying to regain control it had lost through months of automatic execution. It was using illness as an excuse to re-establish negotiation as the norm. He stood up. He ran the entire routine, and he wrote, "I realized today that the mind never stops trying to regain control through negotiation. It just gets more sophisticated in its arguments. At first, it offers obvious excuses. You're tired, you lack motivation, you can start tomorrow. When you reject those, it offers more elaborate reasons. You need rest for optimal performance. You need to be kind to yourself. You need to balance discipline with self-care. And if you keep rejecting them, it eventually offers arguments that sound like profound wisdom. But they are all just different ways of the same attempt to get you back to negotiating instead of automatically executing. You are losing precisely at this moment of sophisticated rationalization. You are no longer creating obvious excuses. You are creating justifications that sound like mature wisdom. You are calling exception flexibility. You are calling negotiation self-awareness. You are calling weakness balance. And as long as you continue to believe in these rationalizations, you never develop the automatism that Baker developed, because true automatism does not accept exceptions, even when the exceptions seem rational. When the war ended in May 1945, Baker returned home having endured over 400 consecutive days of performing the same morning routine without exception. My grandfather recorded that most veterans returned and tried to resume normal life, tried to forget the war, tried to reintegrate into civil society, as if the years of combat were a chapter that could be closed. But Baker discovered that he couldn't simply switch off the automatism he had developed. Not because he was traumatized or because he couldn't adapt, but because he had become fundamentally different through 400 days of non-negotiation. He noted, "I came home and discovered that I can no longer function as a normal person. Normal people negotiate with themselves every day. They decide whether to get up or not. They decide whether to work or not. They decide whether to run or not. I no longer have that option. My body simply runs because that's what kept it alive for 400 days. During the first few months after returning, Baker documented the devastating difference between himself and other veterans. Many returned with the same psychological wounds, the same traumas, the same difficulties in readjusting. But while most struggled to find purpose, to rebuild discipline, to function in civilian society again, Baker simply transferred the automatism developed in combat to civilian life. He woke up at 5 in the morning. He performed a physical routine. He worked without negotiation, not because he was stronger or more motivated than other veterans, but because he had transformed execution into identity through 400 days of repetition, and identity does not disappear when circumstances change. He wrote, "Other veterans try to build discipline in civilian life. I don't need to build because I am already disciplined. War didn't give me discipline. It transformed me into discipline through repetition so profound that stopping would be existential death." But what my grandfather emphasized most was the part where Baker described the social cost of this transformation. People around him didn't understand. They thought he was obsessive, rigid, incapable of relaxing. They suggested he needed to learn to be more flexible, more balanced, more normal. And Baker tried to explain that it wasn't obsession or rigidity. It was simply who he had become. Trying to be flexible would be like asking his heart to beat more relaxed. Daily execution had become as automatic as involuntary functions, and trying to negotiate with that would contradict the very structure of his identity. He noted, "Most people will never understand because they have never experienced identity transformation through brutal repetition. They think discipline is something you either have or you don't. They don't understand that it's something you become when you repeat the same action long enough that the action and you are indistinguishable." You're facing the exact same misunderstanding that Baker faced. People around you will say you're being obsessive if you run every single day without exception. They'll say you need balance, flexibility, to learn to relax. And you'll believe them because they sound reasonable, but they've never developed real automatism. They've never transformed into discipline. They've never experienced the freedom of not having to negotiate with themselves every day. And as long as you listen to advice from people who live negotiating, you'll never become who Baker became, Captain George. Baker lived 58 more years after the war ended. When he died at 82, my grandfather found one last diary entry written just days before his death. Baker had noted, "I lived 82 years, but my real life began at 24, when I finally stopped bargaining with myself and started executing without question. Everything I built, everything I became, everything that meant anything came from 400 initial days of brutal execution that killed the inner negotiator and transformed me into discipline incarnate. The first 24 years were wasted, waiting for motivation that never came. The next 58 years were lived in such deep automatism that execution ceased to be a choice and simply became who I was." My grandfather had kept this last entry separately because it proved that transformation developed through brutal daily repetition was not a temporary change that disappeared when circumstances improved. It was a permanent reconstruction of identity. During those 58 years after the war, Baker maintained the same morning routine he had developed in combat, not because he was stuck in the past or because he couldn't adapt, but because he had discovered that daily execution without negotiation was the difference between living the life he chose and living the life his negotiating mind chose for him. He noted in a 1970 entry, "People ask me why I still wake up at 5 in the morning at 49, 25 years after the end of the war. They don't understand that it's not about waking up early. It's about not negotiating. The time is arbitrary. What matters is that my body executes without consulting my mind, and this automatic execution is what has freed me from decades of internal negotiation that keeps most people trapped their whole lives." Baker had understood that true freedom doesn't come from having more options. It comes from eliminating the option of negotiation through automatism so profound that execution is the only possible response. You are reading about Baker 80 years after he began performing the same morning routine without exception. 80 years and the truth hasn't changed. You don't win battles when they come. You win them months beforehand through 1,000 small daily repetitions that transform conscious choices into automatic responses. And as long as you keep waiting for motivation, waiting for perfect circumstances, waiting to feel like performing, you will continue losing to yourself every day. If you want to honor Captain George Baker and the 400 days of brutal execution that completely transformed his life, then like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment describing what your non-negotiable morning routine will be starting tomorrow. Don't abandon this soldier who meticulously documented the difference between life and death so that you could learn. Help spread this knowledge to others who are stuck in constant negotiation, pretending that one day they will have discipline. Captain George Baker spent 400 days executing the same morning routine without exception, transforming discipline into such profound automatism that stopping would be an existential contradiction. He didn't wake up early because he was motivated. He woke up because he had become disciplined through brutal repetition that completely killed the inner negotiator. 80 years later, you continue doing the opposite. You negotiate with yourself every day. Wait for motivation to appear. Believe that when it really matters, you will execute. And while you negotiate, you lose to yourself in every decision. Every morning, every moment you choose comfort instead of execution. Baker survived 400 days of combat because his body executed automatically. Soldiers beside him died because they hesitated, trying to consciously decide what to do. What is the one non-negotiable routine that you will start executing tomorrow at the same time without exception for the next 120 days? Or will you continue to lose to yourself pretending that one day you will have discipline?